Hey there everybody, it's Amanda. How's it going? I wanted to make a quick little video about Morbius. Morbius the Living Vampire. Yes, because I have just now come, about an hour ago, back from seeing the new movie starring Jared Leto, all about Morbius. This is a movie that I have been waiting for since I was about 8 years old for them to finally make a Morbius movie. I love Morbius. He's one of my favorite characters of all time. I think he's an exceptional character. I spent most of my childhood just completely obsessed with Morbius, collecting Morbius things, all the comic books, t-shirts, posters, toys. I have a really pretty big collection of Morbius stuff. But unfortunately, most of it's packed away in storage now, so I grabbed a couple of things, but I mean, there's so much more I wish I had, easy access to show people in this video. Maybe I'll make a follow-up at some point or another. I mean, I'll just say right off the bat, I didn't hate this movie. I mean, this movie is getting a lot of flack. I mean, people really, really hate it. Some of that may have to do with Jared Leto. I don't know. I know people really don't like him. And I don't know enough of the backstory of, like, why he's garnered so much of people's ire. I don't know whether it's because of his appearance as Joker or what. I really don't know. I don't know much about him as an actor or other things that he's done outside of this and Joker or Suicide Squad, right? So I'm kind of in the dark about that part of it. I have to say that I think that this was really good casting. He looks like Morbius. I mean, both out of the vampire makeup and in the vampire, thing, just physically speaking, this was a really good, appearance of Morbius. He really looked like Morbius, and I really did appreciate that. I think that this Morbius is kind of based on some of the more recent iterations. There have been a couple of attempts, in the last, 10, 15 years to kind of restart a proper Morbius series. As far as I know, all of them have failed. I have a lot of that stuff. I don't have a great memory of it. I think one of them was in 2015, and there was an earlier one, I think. Those are not iterations that left enough of an impression on me to where I really could tell you too much or a lot of the specifics, but I do think that that's where this backstory came from of, Morbius and his friend, who I don't even remember his name now, Nikos? Miles? It's Miles, right? I don't think it's Miles. I can't remember. But this whole thing of them having been in an orphanage and they both have this blood disease as children, and, he wants to cure his friend. That is not anywhere in the backstory of the Morbius that I grew up with. It just isn't. They did get the Greece thing right. He does originate from Greece. He was a brilliant scientist who cured this blood disease. He did not invent a synthetic blood. That is also something that did not originate in the 70s or 80s or 90s. The Morbius that I'm most familiar with. And he also did not snub the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in the original version of the character, and then as far as I know, was healthy growing up and most of his life, and then contracted this rare blood disease. And then, yes, on a boat, they did get that part right, he, does try to cure himself with the use of these vampire bats. It was kind of interesting to see what they did with some of these other characters, because Martine was not a scientist as far as I remember in the original comics. She was just a woman that he was in love with. He did have a best friend. The best friend's name was Nikos, and he does, in the original appearances, kill Nikos. And it does have other friends along the way, but I mean, I don't, yeah. But so, where this movie really didn't succeed as a version, as an iteration of the character of Michael Morbius, is that, Morbius is this tragic character. He's this, great man who is capable of so much good. you know, and now he's thrown into this horrible dilemma, this you know, of being a vampire and having to, you know, having this bloodlust, and having to kill people, and he, you know, the Morbius that I grew up with is tortured by this. You know, he doesn't want to have this existence, and he's constantly on the search for a cure to his vampirism. I should say, just for, you know, those that are unfamiliar, so Morbius did start out originally as a Spider-Man villain. His first appearances were, I think, the Amazing Spider-Man issue 101 and 102, where, you know, it was actually kind of a classic time of Spider-Man, like where he has the 6 arms and he's fighting the lizard and all this, and I don't really remember how the lizard gets wrapped up in all this, but 102 is like the whole backstory of Morbius. I don't have it, but I know that, I think, you know, in celebration of the film, they did release recently like a Morbius Omnibus. That's really expensive the last time I looked at it, but it might, you know, for anybody that's actually interested, you know, in absence of maybe picking up some of the original appearances, that might be a great way to, you know, see the whole backstory. But anyway, so yeah, so he started out as a Spider-Man villain, and made many a Spider-Man appearance. I don't really have any of that in front of me, unfortunately. He had a terrible costume. It was this like blue and red leotard thing. And you know, kind of like palled around with Doctor Strange and little bit of Ghost Rider at that time with the Legion of Monsters. He and Werewolf by Night. He had 2 comics that he essentially took over. So the first one was Adventure into Fear, which previously, like, you know, kind of had belonged to like different characters like Man-Thing. But Morbius took over that title for like a long time. I have most of those, but again, I don't have them in front of me. The other book that he took over at that time, sorry about that. Yeah, so I have most of those, but the other book that he took over entirely was Vampire Tales, which is, you know, these incredible magazine-style black and white comics, and these were incredibly hard to find when I was a kid. You know, my mother drove me to a million different little, you know, dusty old gross comic book stores, and, you know, lots of digging through things. I mean, it really took a long time to find. There was no eBay back then, so it really took a long time to find some of this stuff, and this was like, you know, just a holy grail find at the time. I mean, this is really an incredible cover. Just one of my favorite comic book, you know, covers of all time. So Vampire Tales was great. I also just want to show this one off real quick, because this was another grail that I found many years later. It's a great cover. It says, "Even Morbius cannot survive the plague of blood." And then, yeah, I mean, you know, what eventually happened was that he bit Spider-Man eventually, and I think was also electrocuted at the same time. I don't quite understand the way it works, but that cured him of his vampirism for a period of time, and he actually went on trial, and his lawyer was She-Hulk. I mean, you can't make this shit up. But again, I mean, this brings to the table a piece of what this movie was missing that I was trying to get to earlier. Like, Morbius in his original iteration is this tortured character that loses a lot more than this film version of Morbius does. I mean, for instance, like, he does have more actual vampire characteristics in the original version. You know, he actually cannot tolerate sunlight. His skin is too sensitive for it, so he does have to hide himself during the day. He's way more out of control, so, like, you know, he pals around with Martine, like, this whole movie, but, you know, in the comics, like, he had to avoid her for years and years and years and years. So he's kind of... And the biggest thing, sorry, I meant to say this a lot earlier, was that there was none of this, like, turning back and forth into a human and a vampire. Like, he was stuck being a vampire 24/7, you know, for years and years. So this Morbius in the film has a lot more, you know, ability to, like, interact with the regular world, you know. And, you know, he gets this sort of respite, you know, when he is cured by Spider-Man's radioactive blood for a while. I don't remember what happens, but at some point he regains his vampirism and goes on, you know, more killing streaks and stuff. He's really quite. He's always a character that's kind of toyed with being some sort of anti-hero because he's likable, you know, but he's never really. It's always been a very tenuous relationship with heroism, let's say, you know, a extraordinarily flawed anti-hero at best, but always really like, you know, 1 foot and like a couple of toes in the villain, you know, grave. You know, I mean, it's always been a very sort of interesting sort of fine line that they walked with him. I think that the golden age of Morbius really was when I was growing up in the 90s. He had his own standalone comic called Morbius the Living Vampire, which I have to say, for at least the first like 20 issues or so, was just a fantastic book. It was very adult. It had some surprising sort of like mature themes to it. He was one of the Midnight Suns. So the Midnight Suns was like a family group. It's a very well-loved promotional poster that I still have from back then. And so it was like a family group of comic books that sort of mainly featured Ghost Rider, Johnny Blaze, you know, Spirits of Vengeance, but also Morbius, the Night Stalkers, which mainly consisted of characters from another famous 1970s horror Marvel comic series called Tomb of Dracula. Those out there listening to this probably are familiar with Blade, at least. So Blade comes from Tomb of Dracula and also was one of the Night Stalkers. So I also really grew up with Blade in a big way. And I was really happy to, you know, see Blade get so famous all of a sudden, because he was actually really like not a well-liked character as one of the Night Stalkers, which is kind of funny. And I know that Morbius actually was going to be, like, in one of the Blade movies, but I know that didn't work out for whatever reason. And then, anyway, Darkhold was one of them. So, Morbius was a big part of this family group of characters, and they had all these big crossovers, and I just ate it up. Just loved every minute of it. Until it turned to shit, and it really did turn to shit after a while. Like, it just became an incoherent mess. But for a period of time, it was so good, and the art was so good. And Morbius looked so good. I don't think he was ever drawn better than in this era. And actually, this is a really interesting issue because the art changes. I can't remember who did the original artwork. You know, for this. It's not a bad panel. There's better ones though, but I mean, I wish I had some of the earlier issues from the series, where some of, like, you know, the really fantastic artwork is. But then halfway through this issue, there was a new artist that took over. I think his name was Sam Siciliano, and this was absolutely some of the worst, you know, Morbius art that ever happened, and it was absolutely tragic, and that really was sort of a big piece of the downfall of the Morbius comic. But I was so obsessed with Morbius the Living Vampire, and I truly believe that this was the best iteration of the character that ever happened. This is actually a recent toy. I can't remember what Marvel toy series this is from, but I mean, this is pretty much Morbius as I knew him. He had ditched the stupid blue and red costume, and he kind of had this, like, just this badass, like, leather, you know, like, bondage gear costume, and, you know, kind of, at little moments, I thought that the Jared Leto character really didn't quite have this outfit, but he had like, the cape, and it really, it did bring it to life in a really great way. But anyway, so I think the real problem with this movie is that, you know, they've taken Morbius and robbed him of all of his motivations, really, because he's not particularly unhappy with his vampirism. I mean, he doesn't like it much, you know, but he's not tortured by it. He has his synthetic blood that is at least staving off having to kill people and, you know, find victims and stuff like that. So he's not really having to face his big ethical dilemmas at all. And he can go about, he sort of can go about his life fairly easily. I mean, even after having killed the guys on the boat, like, there's not much that's sort of, limiting his movement. He can walk around in the sun. So he just is, and he can switch back. He can be a normal human being. He doesn't have to, he doesn't have to remain a vampire 24/7, which is like a really big deal. So he's not trapped, as a monster 24/7. So when you take all that away, you're sort of left with a much flatter, much less interesting character, and it's a shame. I would have liked to have seen a representation of Morbius with that kind of depth to him. It was, Morbius in the comics, in the 90s comics, did actually, he found basically some sort of serum eventually, which allowed him to look human again, for like a couple of hours, and that was like a big deal. So he did eventually be able to kind of shift between vampire and human with the use of this other thing that he had found. But yeah, I mean, this is the Morbius of the Jared Leto Morbius. Really, he hasn't had to face a lot of the hardships, that the actual comic book version of Morbius had to face. And I don't know why they necessarily made the decision to do that. Maybe people don't really want to see a sad vampire boy character as much as they want to see this. I really don't know. I mean, because he is a weepy kind of sad vampire man. That's the Morbius I know and love. That having been said, I didn't hate this at all. I mean, I really had a good time, honestly. I didn't go into this with some sort of chip on my shoulder. I was genuinely just really happy that they finally made a Morbius movie. I think he is a great character. I hope that this means that people will go and explore the character further and maybe, read some of these older iterations. In the Omnibus, I don't know if they've gone as far as to reprint some of the stuff from the 90s. I hope they have. Again, I think the early part of that series was so good and so worth people, revisiting. A lot of the early Midnight Suns stuff was, or some of the early stuff from the Night Stalkers was excellent. The first issue of Darkhold is beautiful. I don't know why they didn't continue that art style through the whole thing. Very few people grew up loving this stuff. So I don't, truthfully, I really don't know how many people are going to take any interest in my incessant ramblings about this stuff. But regardless, it is the time to do it, is now, honestly, because this movie did just come out and it is in the public conscious. So why not make a video rambling about it for a while? I've only been dying to do so for, a couple of decades. I have an excuse to do so for a couple of decades. So I don't know, if anybody out there would like to see more of my Morbius stuff, I mean, I could definitely at some point do a follow-up video, maybe showing some of the rarer comic book appearances that I do have. But for now, I'll leave it at this. I mean, I don't go in, if you do go see it, I mean, just don't, I don't know how many people are really going to this movie with any prior knowledge of Morbius. And I could see having a negative reaction either way. Like, if you're really somebody who loves Morbius, you might be very upset by the fact that he's been robbed of his depth and motivation. I mean, his motivation had to become this friend of his that is now, happy with his vampirism and is killing people and stuff. And Morbius is far more interesting a character than having to, plant a whole other character to give him motivation. He is his own motivation. He's got plenty of his own motivation unto himself. It really isn't necessary to write this character that way, but they did it. It is what it is. But I mean, I could definitely understand why people who don't know anything about Morbius could go see this and say, what a flat, boring fucking character. I did want to just add real quick, I mean, something that I think is really worth mentioning about Morbius is I really do think this may have been the first example of a undead vampire. Like, the idea of a vampirism created by science, I know, was something that really excited me as a kid. I thought that was such a cool element of the character, that even though he did have some of the typical, vampire issues like sunlight and stuff, it was a whole different ball game, and I just found that so creative. And I would really love to see them maybe try it again one day, and maybe make a more like 90s inspired Morbius movie. It's a little too much Batman reference. I mean, the whole thing with the bats and they're my friends, and I mean, it doesn't. Morbius didn't do that. You don't have to have Morbius do that. He doesn't do that. So it was a little silly. I mean, aside from the experiment that actually caused the vampirism in the first place, Morbius never did anything with bats. I don't know whether they did that because it's a Jared Leto thing. It's like, well, you were in Batman, you have to have bats now all the time. I really don't know what the thinking behind that was. But yeah, anyway, I mean, it's a fun little flick. I had a good time. What can I say? But definitely a character that I'd like to see explored more. I don't want to. I should have given a spoiler warning. I will say there is 2 really heavy-handed teasers to a sequel in this, and I don't know what. So Michael Keaton was one of them. I don't have any idea what that was about. And then the second one, I think that was the Falcon. Was that the Falcon? I have no idea what that was. First of all, if it is the Falcon, I don't know of any instance where Morbius met the Falcon. Maybe it exists and I just never knew about it. I have no idea. But yeah, so I guess we're gonna see more. I can't imagine they're gonna make the character. I mean, I just think he's gonna become flatter and flatter if they continue on with him in future movies. At least in this, with this, with the same cast or conception of the character. I'll just leave it at this. One of Morbius's like friends during the 90s was Venom. And they did do several, or at least one or two standalone like mini series titles together, and they were great. So that is something I'd love to see. Maybe a Morbius Venom team up. They made a surprisingly great team back in the old days. So they're I don't know about pairing him with the fucking Falcon, but I'm just saying there is some real potential there for crossover films, I think. But we'll see. I'm just again, I'm just really happy they made the thing. I didn't go in with expectations. I wasn't disappointed. I had a great time. I just we just lived through 2 years of a pandemic, and now finally I can go see a Morbius movie. I really can't complain too much. But anyway, thank you to anybody that watched. I'm sorry this was kind of a ramble. Yeah, all the best and bye for now. More at some point. Okay, take care, everybody. Thanks again. Bye. Okay, hi again. Sorry. One thing I did forget to mention that I did just want to make sure I say is that so it took Morbius in the comics an embarrassingly long time, like at least 2 decades, to come to the decision that he should not just randomly kill people. This kind of goes back to what I was saying about his tenuous relationship between hero and villain. He really just would kill random people and drink their blood, for the most part, for all of the 70s, most of the 80s. And then it really was in the 90s that he sort of made this resolve, mostly because of Ghost Rider telling him he had to, or else, that, he would only basically kill and drink the blood of people that were criminals. And so he did kind of become this strange vampire superhero in a sense, where he was defending he was going after like prostitution rings. I mean, not the women, but the men leading it. People that were raping people or you know, selling drugs or doing terrible things. He would go after these people, and those would be the people that he would target. And he became resigned to that. And you know, I have to say that would have made a really fascinating film. I don't remember, honestly, if the more, you know, recent comic book iterations of the character played with that concept. But that really did change the game on Morbius in the 90s. And it would, you know, everything kind of got spoiled by this idea of the synthetic blood that he had supposedly created before he was a vampire. Like, he really just didn't have to face any of this. But if he had to, you know, he would have been making these decisions of, like, do I just, you know, kill these random people in the street for their blood, or do I actually go and, you know, try to save people from these other people that are victimizing these individuals, and punish those individuals. Again, a terribly flawed, you know, anti-hero kind of character. I mean, those, you know, lots of ethical dilemmas and trespasses, you know, in all of that as well. But definitely, that was a much more interesting concept that they introduced in the 90s that really added this huge depth and pathos to his character, that it was sad to not see. Because I don't really think there's not too many sort of like vampiric justice characters. You know, I don't know what to really call it. But Morbius did, for a time anyway, become that. He really did sort of become as much of a hero as a vampire could be. And so, you know, if they do continue with further film appearances of him, it would be nice to see some of that explored, but they probably won't. Bring back Morbius's pathos. I want to see the living vampire's pathos. But, you know, in the meantime, maybe I'll just reread the old appearances. Okay, I had to add that. All the best. Bye for now. Thank you, everybody.